Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our far-flung audience on multiple continents for day 2 of our conference, our colloquium on stepping back from the precipice. Are we doing enough regarding the various facets, challenges, and potential solutions to conflict in the Sahel? I'd like to thank Next Tier SPD and its principal, their principal, Patrick Okigbo, and partner Dr. Nnamdi Obasi for partnering with SAIS African Studies on this 2-day meeting. And I'd also like to acknowledge the leadership in preparing the meeting from Professor Chiedo Nwankwor, who will be today's moderator, a leading member of the faculty and a lecturer at SAIS African Studies and director of SAIS Women Lead. And special thanks to Sonia Holmes and Pedro and Giselle Povedano, who has done really outstanding work in helping to organize this colloquium and the meetings over 2 days. Yesterday's discussion was far-reaching, perceptive, and informative. The panelists presented a variety of insights from different vantages, speaking from the perspective of academic, security, and political backgrounds. And very briefly, a few themes and conclusions can be highlighted, which I think might be of interest to today's audience and can help us take our conversation forward today. First of all, speakers referenced a set of key drivers and enabling conditions that are fueling and have been aggravating conflict across the Sahel region of West Africa. Among the leading causes are the following. Virtually all of the speakers referenced poverty as an important structural background factor, both urban and rural poverty, but an especially significant dimension has been the deprivation of isolated rural communities, which facilitates their role both as a source of recruitment, but also as a target for occupation and traversing and trafficking in arms and so forth from armed groups. So isolated communities, particularly border communities, are vulnerable to being enveloped in conflict, and they can also be important elements in those dynamics. But poverty is an important background factor. Demography is an important background factor. The youth bulge and low population densities clearly contribute to the development of insurgency and the spread of violence across the region. Governance was a third factor referenced by virtually all of the speakers. Overall state weakness is a problem. Issues of unequal development create perceptions and experiences of marginalization. The poor provision of public goods is an integral part of this, including basic law and order functions, but also education, health, basic administration, and so forth. So poor governance. As a sort of subset or a subsidiary issue or an integral issue in poor governance, corruption and the detachment of elites are also important drivers in the perpetuation of conflict. Porous borders and marginalized border communities, as I've noted, are also increasingly or integrally important in driving conflict. Many speakers also pointed to spillovers across countries, and we've seen this in the Boko Haram ISWAP complex, which has enveloped Cameroon, Chad, Niger Republic as critical neighboring states which have seen spillovers. But then also there have been spillovers from Mali, from Burkina Faso, from Niger Republic, from Libya and southern Algeria. So there are a wide array of spillover effects across the region. And part of this it also has to do with the expansion of small arms and light weapons networks and flows across the region, which was an important, if you will, knock-on effect or aftermath of the fall of the Gaddafi regime in Libya, which saw armories and large numbers of fighters disperse through the sub-region, creating really a new network and a new market for small arms and light weapons. So poverty, demography, governance, corruption, spillover effects, these were the key drivers and enabling factors that yesterday's panelists discussed. The discussants also focused on several core problems that have hampered effective action to stem conflict. They referenced problems of coordination and cooperation among the diverse states and militaries across the region. There are different state capabilities, there are different elite commitments among different countries, and there is an Anglophone, Francophone divide, which has complicated the coordination among governments and security forces. There are fundamental problems and persistent issues surrounding political and social inclusion. Marginalized communities and marginalized identities are vectors for violent mobilization. So that was another issue and core problem that the speakers discussed. And then finally, there was a lot of focus on the political economy of conflict and the recognition that once conflicts accelerate to a certain point, various actors actually gain an interest in the perpetuation of conflict. Armed groups, security forces, political leaders may all profit from resource flows, the availability of armed groups for political purposes, the traffic in various weapons or money, and different groups may skim or find a direct benefit from these resources that arise from conflict. And this can quickly lead to a kind of equilibrium in which the conflict may or may not escalate, but which nobody has the capacity to really stem the, or not the capacity, but the incentive to really stem conflict. So collusion between security forces and armed groups, between communities, with politicians, collusion can perpetuate conflict and prevent interventions that could mitigate violence. So today's speakers, I'm sure, will reference many of these issues as contributing and framing factors and drivers in the diverse conflicts in the Sahel region. But today's speakers will also be focusing more directly on policy tools and political initiatives that might constructively address conflicts in the region. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce Professor Chiedo Nwankwor, who will moderate today's session and introduce our distinguished group of panelists. Professor Nwankwor is a lecturer and leading member of the faculty in the SAIS African Studies program, and she directs SAIS Women Lead, which advances academic and professional roles for women in international affairs. She has worked extensively on issues of gender, political inclusion, and development in Africa, ranging from representation among elites to problems of education and advancement for girls and women in northern Nigeria. So a broad academic agenda. Without further delay, I will turn things over to Professor Nwankwor and welcome everybody to the colloquium today.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you all for joining us again today from across the various regions of the world. Today is the second day and the second and final day of this conference, as Peter noted. And we will be exploring opportunities and possible solutions to the conflict. Thank you also, Peter, for that succinct summary of yesterday's panel, which sets us up for the discussion today, which will focus on exploring opportunities and proffering solutions to the crisis in the Sahel. With me to discuss this today are Mrs. Esther Daramola from the Directorate of Early Warning, ECOWAS Commission, Mr. Nnamdi Obasi, Senior Advisor on Nigeria International Crisis Group, Dr. Ukoha Ukiwo, Technical Lead and Conflict Advisor, Managing Conflict in Northeast Nigeria of the EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa, Dr. Susanna Wing, Associate Professor of Political Science, Haverford College, author of Constructing Democracy in Africa, Mali in Transition. And last but not least, Mr. Thomas Schiller, Director, Regional Program, Konrad Adenauer, Stiftung, Mali. Just before we start, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. A few housekeeping notes. Please feel free to send in your questions and comments at any time during this event using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can also engage with us through Twitter at SAIS Africa and Next Year SPD. Okay, we have a lot to discuss today, so let's get started. The West African Sahel is inundated, as many of the speakers noted yesterday, with multiple actors with different and often non-aligned interests. How can we enhance coordination among intervening institutions? How can we integrate the efforts of the multiple actors operating in the region? Mr. Nnamdi and Dr. Ukoha, if you don't mind, perhaps you can start us off. So let's go with Mr. Obasi first, and then Dr. Ukoha.
Am I okay?
Yes, you are.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. I must start by thanking SAIS and Professor Lewis and Chiedo especially for putting this together, and also Next Year SPD for the collaboration. I think it's a very good platform, and we benefited a great deal from it yesterday. I think the point was well made yesterday about the multiplicity of actors. And I would like to say that it's not just about military actors or development actors, it's across the entire spectrum. I mean, actors involved in knowledge generation and research are fragmented across the region. Actors involved in advocacy are fragmented across the region. Actors involved in humanitarian support services and relief efforts are fragmented. Actors involved in military operations are fragmented, and so on and so forth. So we really have to think of very creative ways of ensuring greater synergy at all levels in order to come to grips with, this problem. Now, nobody is under the illusion that we are going to have a uniform, single platform for dealing with these issues. The Sahel is a very complex place. Some of the issues we are dealing with are, general to the entire region. Some are specific to certain regions. They have local, underpinnings and so on and so forth. So there will always be different ways of looking at the issues. But certainly, there is need for greater communication, which is why a platform like this, an event like this, is extremely useful. There is a need for greater communication for different actors to come together on the same platform and understand what they are doing between one with another. There is also a need for greater coordination. Communication is one thing. We know what we're doing and then we go our different ways. But we can also go beyond that to establish more routine ways of exchanging information and communicating, and therefore being able to work together on those platforms. I think it's also important to do sometimes a mapping of what various actors are doing so that we don't have overlapping efforts in which efforts are concentrated by different actors, various layers in a particular place, and other areas are left unattended to. So I think these are the three levels on which I think we need to concentrate efforts in harmonizing the efforts and activities of different actors, exchanging information a lot better to understand what we're doing, creating platforms for cooperation in order to reduce waste, and then thirdly, to map our efforts in a way that we see exactly where the big holes are and where the efforts are being over-concentrated. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Obasi. And Dr. Ukiwo.
Yeah, thank you, Chiedo and Peter and Patrick and your respective institutions for this platform and for having me. I will just proceed from where Nnamdi has left it to say that it is important to address the reasons why we are not having effective coordination. And what are the reasons? One is conflict. The different intervening agencies have historical and contemporary conflicts. And while it may look ironical, I think the starting point for coordination for intervening agencies is to even address the conflicting issues around them. And here we talking about, at the point in which we have the world is changing from the wisdom we've had over time around multilateralism, where there is cooperation at different actors. We are moving towards a tendency in unilateralism. Amongst the world, we seem to have a divide between the US and the current administration there at the time and United Kingdom on one hand, and Europe, France, and other actors on the other hand. And those ideological differences are increasingly impinging and impacting on cooperation and coordination in intervention. At the Africa regional level, we have also this serious conflict. We are at a time where Pan-Africanism is at its lowest ebb. Conflicts not only at the state level, but also at the citizen level. So if you take Nigeria, for instance, it's not clear what the state of relationship between Nigeria and South Africa, Nigeria and Ghana, Nigeria and Cameroon, Nigeria and Chad, what is the state of that relationship and how to, and not only at the state level, but also at the level of the citizenship, the citizenry and how citizens of this rest. So we need to address those issues because they are increasingly coming in the way of coordination. And here, the key issue is to identify what interests are, so in coordinating, it's important that the different actors come to understand what shared interests are, what the divergent interests are, and what the strategic goals should be. Nnamdi has mentioned the issue of communications, key, very, very key, because without communication and joint planning, you have quite a lot of surprises and lack of predictability. So I'll give an instance where this has really undermined effort. So if, for instance, in the context of Northeast Nigeria, the Nigerian military at a point in time came up, and changed their strategy to the, garrison strategy, super camp strategy. And this was done, it was a big surprise to other actors because of lack of information sharing. And so certain things that needed to have been done at this level of civil society or even the respective state governments were not put in place. On the other hand, also, some of the state governments have embarked upon proactive efforts to resettle people, communities back to their areas of location. Now, that effort is not being done in sync with security operatives, with civil society. Nnamdi mentioned the research community, to find out what is the needs assessment. Has assessment been made in terms of livelihood opportunities that are available in these areas that resettlement is taking place? Has assessment been made in terms of security that is there? So what this has done is to create surprises, and this creation of surprises often tend to be in the sense that each actor wants to take credit, wants to get a mention on what they have done. But if we come to a point where the strategic goal is identified, right, and the contributions of all actors are also identified, then there will be that efforts towards better collaboration, so that we have a relationship that is not competitive, okay, but more cooperative and collaborative.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Dr. Ukiwo. Climate change, as we all know, continues to pose a severe danger to the livelihoods of the Sahel's populations. Since the 1970s, the Sahel has warmed twice as fast as the rest of the world. Mark Lowcock, who heads the United Nations Humanitarian and Emergency Relief in Sahel, noted recently that most public policy efforts at both national and international levels are treating symptoms rather than their causes. What are some concrete strategies to addressing the push factor of climate change in the Sahel? Mr. Schiller and Dr. Wing, if you don't mind, going in that order.
First of all, let me thank you also from my part very much for having the opportunity to participate in this discussion, and very warm greetings from Bamako to all of you. If you don't mind, I would like, first of all, to make a little contribution about the first question concerning the actors you mentioned, and I wanted to state that I do very much agree with what Mr. Obasi said, and he's right that we do have a multiple spectrum of actors here in the Sahel region, which is, from my point of view, in part more a problem than a solution. We even have now multiple coordination institutions. So even when we talk sometimes about lack of coordination, there are also a lot of coordination structures which have been created already. If you think about the Alliance Sahel, if you think about the Coalition for the Sahel of the recent summit in Pau of the French with the G5 countries. So this is really a huge problem here to coordinate all the actors, be it in the security area, be it in the development area, or in the political cooperation area. Referring to your question concerning climate, the effects of climate change, I would extend it a little bit, that we have to link this, from my point of view, with also demographics. So we have effects, obviously, of climate change here in the region, but I'm not sure if the main factor of what we see currently as problems in the rural areas is not also driven by demographic increase and by changes in the use of the land. So when you talk to people who live in rural areas, they often tell you that traditional ways of sharing and using land do no longer work, and that this creates conflict, and that this creates more problem also to nutrition security. And so you have an interlinked problem concerning this, this topic. What can we do? There are a lot of organizations working on this. There are a lot of government structures, also from my point of view, sometimes too many, addressing this. If you look at, for example, here in Mali or in Burkina Faso, you have several secretariats, general secretariats, ministries responsible for addressing these questions. And this does not help often also to have a coordinated approach. And last thing, perhaps, because you mentioned in your question concerning the actors, especially Mr. Obasi mentioned it, that we do not only talk about the security issues in this context, but also on the development side. And there you have, unfortunately, also a very an approach which is often not regional, but which is based on individual nations. So, for example, development agency XYZ, NGO XYZ works in Mali, but sometimes not in Burkina Faso, or they work in Burkina Faso and in Mali, but often there is not even coordination between the activities of the in the two different nations. And when you look at the region as such, you can see that of course you need an integrated approach, in also concerning your question concerning climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schiller. Dr. Wing?
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank those of you from SAIS for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Just briefly on the question of climate change. So my background is in Mali, and I think that it really behooves us to look at the ground very closely at how individual actors themselves are adjusting as they can. What are the most direct crises that they face in terms of climate change, dealing with the change in agricultural possibilities, right? The change in what they have access to in the market, what they can bring in the market. And so again, when we think about integration and trying to bring all of these fragmented entities together, I just put the poverty and the issues of security fall under climate change. So I see all of these things as really integral. So as we try to think about who best to include in terms of conversations of what communities are facing on the ground, we need to go to the local level, and we need to talk to those people who are precisely watching their crops fail and figure out what it is that they need specifically. So that's a really brief comment, but I think it's about looking closer to the grassroots in order to understand where coordination is needed and what is needed at local level. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wing, looking closer at the grassroots. Okay, just to follow up on that, high level diplomacy, example, ECOWAS, the ECOWAS Track 1 diplomacy, often involves current and former heads of state. This almost guarantees an all-male team, right? Because we know that it's just been Sirleaf Erling Johnson in Africa as the head of state, and also perhaps Joyce Banda, depending on who you're asking. And so what are the opportunities for women's participation in peace processes on all levels in the region? And how have the peace processes in Mali worked out, right, in terms of gender inclusion? What have the gender dynamics been so far? Are there actually other success stories that we can look to? Mrs. Daramola and Dr. Wing, and then Dr. Ukoha, if you don't mind.
Thank you very much, Professor Chiedo and the entire SAIS team for the invitation. I bring very warm greetings from the ECOWAS Commission in Abuja. I think recently efforts have been made to prioritize gender mainstreaming in preventive diplomacy and mediation at the regional level. Recent policy provisions include the commitment to gender mainstreaming in the ECOWAS mediation guidelines of 2018, which stipulates that 30% of female of the composition of the ECOWAS Council of the Wise will be reserved for females. These policies are complemented by commissioned assessment study on gender inclusion and effective mediation in West Africa. So that's for track one. But also encouraging is the fact that women's groups form an integral part of the West African Civil Society Forum, and they really serve as a channel to bring to bear the experiences of civil society groups in mediation at the track two level, complementing the regional efforts in this regard. The women's group in Mali in particular, going to your question, largely supported by the UN Women, have been relentless, and they've been so well mobilized over the past decade when it comes to mediation. At the time when the conflict in the northern part of Mali erupted in 2012, Mali issued its first national action plan for the implementation of Resolution 1325. And in 2015, we will recall, it passed a law establishing a 30% gender quota in appointments to political offices. But even with all these policy initiatives, women were completely sidelined at the beginning of the formal peace processes, and the extent of their participation was actually a result of their own deliberate and spirited efforts to be included. And even though they were not formally invited, they managed to find their way to participate at the initial peace negotiations in Ouagadougou in 2012, and were able to include some of their concerns in the agreement. And later, during the negotiations of Bamako that led to the Bamako Agreement, women made, the negotiators were made of 5% of women and 15% of the signatories. So I think that's, those figures actually indicate some level of progress if you consider where we're coming from. So certainly at both track one and track two, there's been some progress, but there's still a lot left to be done, such as ensuring that the mandates of the diplomatic missions, the mediation teams, have provisions relating to the differential impacts of the conflict on men and women, including, of course, the very topical issue of gender-based violence. Also ensuring that the conditioning, that parties are conditioned to ensure that both women in the peace processes participate not just in equal number, but also in capacity of the participation. And also maybe developing a gender database that includes women and men to ensure that gender mainstreaming is actually effective when it comes to track one diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Dr. Wing?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think it's wonderful to hear that the numbers of women who are being incorporated in meetings in Bamako and Ouagadougou and participating in this level of action. And, you know, going back to the comments that Peter Lewis made at the beginning, at the outset today, and that emerged from yesterday's conversation, and that is thinking about improved governance and thinking about addressing poverty. And I would like us to think about taking the conversation from not just the high level, which is extremely important, right? But also, how does this filter down to regional and more local action in terms of who is involved and who is participating? So my experience has shown in Mali that part of the problem about engaging any actor from civil society or even at the government, well, particularly civil society, but also at the government level, is that there's a kind of a jockeying for positioning and place because of competition over who's going to get access to the resources to use to implement this or that project. And it's precisely this kind of situation in which there isn't an incentive to necessarily work together to see things brought to fruition, right? And actual projects following through all the way so that people at the more local levels are seeing the results of this. And so this is just to say, I guess, that if we're trying to think about ways to alleviate poverty at the local level, I would look and see about how women are organizing themselves at the very local and regional level. What are people doing, and how can those networks be used to try to address both security and poverty issues? So I guess particularly in Mali, where we have just recently seen yet another coup, there's just become this disconnect between what people are doing and trying to do at the very high levels and how people are experiencing that in places far-flung from Bamako and Ouagadougou. So it's just, I guess it's a complementary approach to try and think about the entire picture. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Wing. And so let's look at the issue of hard and soft approaches to solving the conflict, right? The fundamental question this conference asks is, are we doing enough, right? Are we doing enough? Is there a way to balance policies and programs that address the underlying drivers of conflict, that's the socioeconomic deficits, issues, versus the kinetic responses to the crisis, right? That's the hard military action. Often the various interventions include at the regional and international level have the military as its face. Do we have a problem of militarization of security in the Sahel, right? Even as some argue that the military remains under-resourced. Is it time to change the model of intervention, including the UN model? Right? Is it time to civilianize security? So let's start with Nnamdi, and then we'll go to Dr. Ukiwo.
Yes, thank you very much. You raised a very valid point about the tension between the hard military responses and the softer approaches to dealing with the challenges in the region. I think that the first problem is that many governments in the region themselves adopt a very short-term view of the problems. They see the security challenges And that immediately invites security responses, hard responses. Even when there's a talk about the softer responses, the softer approaches, it's more like lip service. And once the security threat, recedes, there's a tendency, to just let the status quo remain and nothing dramatic is done, going forward. I think there's a need to understand very, very clearly at national and regional levels that the problems that we're dealing with are not military problems. The military can provide short gaps, short-term solutions and fill some gaps and so on. But ultimately, as was pointed out in the discussions yesterday, we are dealing sometimes with historical problems. We are dealing with deep-seated cultural problems. We are dealing with structural vulnerabilities and so on. And none of this is a quick fix. And so governments have to think of, yes, we're going to combine both approaches, the military approach and the soft approach. But the military approach will be short-term. The longer challenge is the long-term approach. Poverty, climate change impacts, the demography and the youth bulge, and illiteracy, and so on and so forth. These are the longer problems that we have to deal with. And so, as much as possible, it depends on the governments in the region to be convinced that whatever military operations are going on at the moment, whatever military responses are developed, these can only be short-term short-term solutions to what are actually long-term problems. And as we are dealing with these, short-term solutions, we need to commit a lot more to the longer-term problems. It's not just a question of, like in the northeast of Nigeria, it's not just a question of, recovering occupied areas and resettling communities, and then they carry on with their life as they did before. It's a question of understanding that it is that life before, that life of misery before, that created grounds for the insurgency to start in the first place. And so unless we dramatically transform the social and economic environment, then we're not going to get any, nearer to the solutions.
Thank you. Dr. Ukiwo, briefly, please, and then we'll go to Mr. Schiller.
Okay. Am I being heard, please?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So just to say that increasingly there is a recognition that we cannot continue to see this in that binary form of hard and soft security. And this is very well being captured in action plans of governments, national security strategy, countering violent extremism strategies, and these are being captured. But what I think is the missing point, the missing link, is having the overarching institution structure to coordinate efforts and bring every effort to a meeting point where there is that understanding that it has to be collaborative. So, and this is part of the reason, and I think that part of the reason for this is really, even though increasingly we have democratic systems of government, we've done security sector reforms in our countries, and the idea about the legitimacy of civil authority and the respect of military actors to civil authorities. Even though we have all that stated, I think the history of military rule in the country and across the region is becoming a problem. So it's still difficult for those in the military sector to want to put themselves under other authorities that will, seek to coordinate what they are doing. And I think that this is a critical point that needs to be addressed, that, that we understand that that needs, but there's need for that agency. Within the Nigerian context, if I may put, an example to this, it was envisaged. Okay, maybe I should stop
here.
Yeah,
maybe we'll come back to that later. And Mr. Schiller, in a minute, please, if that's possible.
Yeah, I will be very brief. Of course, that was just has been said is, but this conventional wisdom that military solutions alone do not exist in the region. From my point of view, the most important thing, and that's why I differ maybe a little bit from what has been said before. My main focus would be strengthening the states in the region, and it's especially the core functions of the states. Though that means territorial administration, that means justice system, that means also the security forces, that means basic education, that means basic health service, because many of these problems we do have because of the fact that the states are not seen, in fact, by their own citizens as efficient, as useful, and that has to change. And that's why, of course, there can't be only military solution. It's about the whole thing. And perhaps one concrete example, because one of our participants asked this in the Q&As concerning what can be done concretely on coordination. Let me tell you from my experience here in the Sahel region, it would already be a very good starting point that the international actors would start at a very low limit of coordination inside their own organizations. Sometimes I meet here people flying in from nearly anywhere, and they are not aware what their own organization is doing in the other country. And so the coordination needs to be sometimes on a very basic level first, before we can talk about a much more broader coordination. Thank you.
Thank you. And so let's go to this issue of a quick poll before we continue. So we have two quick questions that I would like you to respond to, if you don't mind. One is up, the first is up on the screen. Please take a quick look and respond. We will disseminate the results of the poll just as soon as it's in. Let's move to the second one. And the second poll is up on the screen. Okay, and we will continue with our discussions. A recent audit of defense contracting in Niger between 2011 and 2019 shows a 300 million misappropriation or corruption in defense contracts, including bogus, inflated, and inflated contracts. In the same period, US military assistance to Niger was pegged at 240 million, right? This is just really outstanding. Is there a way to urge more transparency in the defense sector as a way to address corruption, thereby increasing efficiency of military institutions? How can foreign partners like the EU help to prevent such wastages in the defense sector? Let's start with Mr. Obasi, and then Dr. Wing and Mrs. Daramola in that order. And if we can go through these as briefly as possible so we can get going. Thank you. While we wait for Mr. Obasi, if we can just have Dr. Ukoha and Mrs. Daramola in that order. Okay, Mr. Obasi is back, yes. Please, as briefly as you can.
Yes, there is indeed a lot of corruption in the defense sector, as there is also in many other sectors of public life and public service in the region. But I think the particular problem of the defense sector is also because it's a sector that, you know, lays a lot of emphasis on a culture of confidentiality and restriction of information and so on and so forth. So it doesn't lend itself to as much scrutiny as other sectors that are a little more open. I think the first two things to focus on in improving transparency in the sector is having stronger legislative oversight of that sector, which also goes to the question of improving governance and improving democracy, deepening democracy. If we have the legislatures that are more scrutinous, that are themselves even more knowledgeable about the defense sector and can raise valid questions about expenditure and accountability, I think we will get a better result within the defense sector. Secondly, the defense sector itself, in virtually all the countries, indeed in all the countries, needs to improve on its internal audit mechanisms. In far too many cases, there is a big boss that just dictates what happens, and there are no questions, there are no checks, and there are no balances, and then there are no whistleblowers, so things just get done and they get covered up. So indeed, within the defense sector, within the ministries of defense and the services, there is a need for much more stronger accounting and auditing systems. Thirdly, there is also a need to de-emphasize the secrecy in the defense sector. As a matter of fact, it's an old concept trying to cover up, we are not fighting external enemies, we're trying to protect ourselves, and therefore the people that we're trying to protect have a right to know exactly what is going on, what is being spent, what is being acquired. It doesn't do anybody any harm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Was I supposed to come in?
Yes, please, in a minute.
Okay, so just to add to that, we also need to ensure that the external actors would embark upon multi-year planning and seek to engage the state defense institutions in joint needs assessments so that interventions feed into budgetary provisions for military hardware and support. And also following up from there, ensure that there is regular monitoring and reporting of what has been done with resources that have been advanced. As Nnamdi mentioned, quite a lot of rules around confidentiality that leads to opaqueness in the sector need to change. But also if we ensure that the support being given are integrated and serve particular needs, so you won't have duplication, so you won't have situations whereby the state has already budgeted for some hardware and that same hardware is also being donated by a partner and the state resources is frittered away. So that type of approach, joint needs assessment, participatory budgeting, and monitoring and evaluation will help to address that. And, of course, the auditing issue that was also earlier mentioned.
Thank you. Dr. Wing, briefly.
Thank you. Okay, so I just want to follow up on the point about, the corruption being across multiple sectors. Obviously, I think one of the key issues here is, of course, that people want security, people are expecting security and a justice system that's functioning. And so how is the state going to be able to function legitimately if people question the very foundation of the security apparatus and the justice system, et cetera? I think that it's possible to ensure that certain mechanisms are in place for accountability, and that is important. At the same time that we recognize that oftentimes these structures are put in place, but there's no incentive to actually follow through and see them functioning as they're designed to function. In other words, right, you create the apparatus, but you don't ensure that the apparatus functions. So my point would be simply to underscore that the corruption in the defense sectors is integral to the corruption, frankly, that we see everywhere, the lack of accountability in governance structures in general, and that's a much deeper problem. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Wing. And so just to sprinkle in some of the questions we have from the audience, Thomas Donglona asks, how can we expect coordination and harmonization between different actors when they are seeking for or have different interests? And Mrs. Daramola, I was wondering if you wanted to respond to that, in addition to the issue of early warning, right? The regional organizations, AU and ECOWAS, have early warning mechanisms. Why have these systems not worked in the region, right? Again, is it an issue of coordination? What is happening? For example, why could it not foresee the recent coup in Mali, given the timeline of these issues? What about the predictable expansion of the Boko Haram conflict in the neighboring countries? Why weren't any of these foreseen? What's happening with these mechanisms?
Thank you, Professor. I think I will start, if I may, with the question concerning early warning mechanisms. I think we need to look at the context in which the existing early warning mechanisms were established, with the AU continental early warning system, QUES, and then the regional ECOWAS early warning system, ECO1, that were developed and designed in the context of intrastate conflict, Liberia, Sierra Leone at the time. So the early warning indicators were predominantly focused on issues of ethnic tensions, the equitable management of resources from the extractive industry, and there was little or no focus really given to the issues, some of the issues we're seeing today in the Sahel, such as climate change. And of course, this gap has become so apparent, which is why in the past year or two, ECOWAS has tried to refine its early warning approach to focus on 5 thematic areas of human security, the first being governance and human rights, the second being climate change and the environment, the third being security, terrorism, violent extremism, the fourth being issues of organized crime, and the fifth being issues of health. That said, I'm not sure that we can really say that early warning did not work at all, especially in a place like Mali, where the ramifications of the Libyan situation were anticipated, coupled with the quantitative and qualitative early warning data that showed the vulnerabilities and risks in the country. Also, on the upside, there's a relatively new early warning mechanism within the G5 Sahel Secretariat, and I'm hopeful and confident that this new mechanism will be better adapted to the context in the Sahel. And of course, the AU mechanism and the ECOWAS mechanism will work in close collaboration with this structure. I think finally, certainly the biggest challenge to early warning is how to incite early and adequate response. The Sahel region is faced with, we've been talking about this for the past hour or so, faced with multiple structural vulnerabilities, some of which early warning systems did certainly pick up. Issues ranging from the economy, demography, climate change. I don't want to belabor the points, we've been talking about them. But responding to these issues comprehensively in a region as vast as the Sahel requires enormous resources, and the limited capacity to respond despite the early warning alerts, I think is the real challenge here. On the issue of coordination, I think Mr. Thomas said it so articulately. There's a lot of actors in the Sahel region. My take would be, when we talk about collaboration, we're talking about collaboration of external partners, we're talking about collaboration of the international community. But I'd like us to give some thought into ensuring that the community, and I think Dr. Wing spoke about this, the community are really part of this conversation.
Okay, thank you. So we'll take a question from Nada Alpha. With the recent developments and the current political transition, there's still need for mediation in Mali. Should the mediation model change, or should it simply be a continuation of previous efforts and building upon the Algiers Accord of 2015? Mr. Schiller, do you want to take that?
Yes, I can do this. Perhaps also Dr. Wing. Let me tell you that from my point of view, personal point of view, we have a very complex situation in Mali. There's no one-size-fits-all solution for mediation. So when we talk about that was taken into place with the Algiers Accords, is completely different to the situation we have in the center of Mali, where we have now, unfortunately, most of the security issues. And this is, so definitively, yes, the answer to this question is yes, you have to adapt, you have to change mediation processes, but they have to be very much adapted to the very, very local level, because sometimes even conflicts are fueled by also very, very local issues. And that's why you cannot have a one-size-fits-all solution. It's sometimes in this region, it might be good to do it this way. In the other region, it might be better to do it that way. And I don't know if Dr. Wing wants to add to this, because she worked also in Mali.
Yes, and just before Dr. Wing, Mr. Obasi or Dr. Ukiwo, any of you want to also wade into this conversation about what the model should be?
No, I'd leave that to experts on Mali.
Do you want me to go ahead and speak?
Yes, please.
Okay. So precisely as Mr. Schiller was saying, that so first looking at the Algiers Accord, you know, there's aspects of it that are useful, but there's a fundamental problem that there are those that were excluded from that original conversation. And so I would advise, frankly, going back to the drawing board with a bit of a more inclusive approach, because we are now 5 years out, and that accord was did not resolve. It basically didn't end the conflict effectively at all. And now what we have in central Mali is, again, I'm gonna continue to hammer this home. It's the problems in central Mali are based on currently the rise of so-called self-defense militias and an ethnicizing of a conflict which is fundamentally economically poverty-based, linked to climate change, right? Again, if and I suppose I would add there, with accusations from people on the ground about the Malian government taking particular sides and supporting militias, et cetera. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of frustration, and there is. I'll give you an example of a village which is no longer there because people fled, and we might think that people fled because of a jihadist threat, but people locally will say, no, they fled because the army pushed them out. And so there's a lack of accountability in terms of, in fact, what the Malian military is doing on the ground. And so I just think that, you know, there needs to be people need to go back to the drawing board and have conversations that around conflict resolution that are more inclusive. And that has been an ongoing complaint about the situation in Mali. And we saw, if you don't bring people to the table, they don't put down their arms necessarily. I'll end there.
Thank you, Dr. Wing. And so we'll take another question from, this one is from Herman Cohen. Would it be feasible to encourage private investments in abattoirs within the northern pastoral regions with refrigerated lorries to export meat to Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, and other coastal nations? The CFA countries would pay in their own currencies, thereby preserving dollars used to import meat from Europe. The northern regions would stop moving animals south on their hoof, causing major weight loss. Thank you. Mr. Obasi, do you want to take this?
Yes, I would, but not in the context of the Central Sahel or the Western Sahel, where he talked about moving cattle down to Ghana and other coastal countries. I would want to speak again about Nigeria, because we do have, similar issues about conflicts arising from the movement of cattle from one part of the country to the other. Well, first of all, I'd like to say this is part of what the government is trying to do through what is now called the National Livestock Transformation Plan, to encourage more sedentary modes of production and more economically efficient and rewarding modes of production, either through grazing reserves or by ranches, and also creating value chains, either from the beef or the dairy dimensions of the livestock industry. It's a win-win situation for everyone. It would reduce friction between herders and farmers. It would improve the economic returns for herders, and it would also be in the interest of the states overall. So I think it's a project that's just started. It needs a lot of support from the international community, in terms of, especially in terms of technical support and experience with countries that have a longer history of organized and modern livestock production. But we think that if it succeeds in Nigeria over the 10-year time frame allocated to it, it might be already a model that other parts of the Sahel can copy or learn a little bit from and adapt to their own circumstances. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And we'll take another question from Elo Nkerewem. How can multiple states coordinate defense needs assessments in practice? Considering that the efforts against ISWAP and Boko Haram, for example, are now transnational, how can states straddle their sovereignty considerations with regional efforts? Consider recent military action by Chad, which appeared unilateral and uncoordinated with neighbors. I think at this point, we'll just open up the floor, and anybody is free to hop in here. You can please unmute yourself and feel free to hop in, or I can continue with my moderating roles. Mr. Schiller, please.
Yes, only from my experience with working with G5 Sahel, because this is the main, also the same issue, G5 Sahel, especially security element of G5 Sahel, so the G5 Joint Force, has been created to operate in the border regions. And we see since 2007, when the Joint Force has been created, that this really is a difficult issue, not so far because of the legal basis about this, but mostly because of the lack of experience of working together in the security forces. And it really takes time. And this is not only the fault of weak security forces in the region. If you talk to European or American soldiers, what I do nearly on a daily basis, they will explain to you with a smile that it took years for NATO after the Second World War to get to an integrated approach concerning security. So this will need time, and that's what we have to tell also people. So when sometimes I heard years ago about G5 and it was presented like a miracle solution for all these border problems, and at the time being already not only me but also other people said, wait, this is a good approach, this is a way to do it, but it will take time. And very often we tend to present things as miracle solutions, and afterwards everybody is disappointed. So that's why I still defend the idea. But when I read now articles about so slamming on smashing on G5 because it doesn't work, I always tell them, hey, it's only 3 years old, the joint force, and G5 Sahel is only there since 2014. So, and if you have ever seen the Secretariat a few years ago, it's a very tiny entity. Yeah? It's not the European Commission or the NATO headquarters in Brussels. So, so that's why we need to stick to these regional approaches, but we need to support this, but we need also to be very much aware of the fact that this will take time. And in the meantime, we have on the second level, we have to reinforce, of course, the national approaches too. So you can't say we do one because the other doesn't work. So we have to do both, and that's why I only would argue that for these regional approaches, be it in the Lake Chad Basin, be it in the 3 border regions of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, we have to invest, and we have to be conscious that this will take a few moments. Huh? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Right, please go ahead.
Yes, I just want to follow the point that Mr. Schiller has made very well, because it applies very much also to the multinational joint task force in the Lake Chad area. This force is just about 5 years old, and it took quite some time to get countries that were mutually suspicious of each other, especially between Nigeria and Cameroon, you know, given the history of border disputes between them. And even as a point was made earlier on, I think by Dr. Ukiwo, about the Anglophone-Francophone divide. But this is something that has transcended all those earlier hurdles, and it has worked for the past 5 years. It hasn't delivered all the results that we expected. But on hindsight, we look at it, have we achieved something? Yes, we have achieved something. Are the countries developing greater understanding among themselves? Yes, they are developing. They have some disagreements from time to time, but then in the long run, this is something that can be sustained, and it's obviously going to be necessary to maintain this arrangement in order to ensure long-term stability around the Lake Chad region. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, go ahead briefly, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about this, and also the issue around investments, the question that was raised, and to emphasize the importance of conflict sensitivity, ideas around do no harm. So whereas it would be very, very important to bring private sector investment into these aspects, we also need to be sensitive to ensure that smallholders and current persons involved in these businesses, that their interests are also factored in. So that is very, very important, because if these new investments are going to lead to loss of livelihoods to existing practitioners, then we will be raising more conflicts in that context. Similarly also, quite some of the challenges that the regional efforts have also encountered has to do with issues around sensitivity and not being sensitive to it. For instance, who heads the institution, and how is that agreed on who heads the force? How are resources shared, and how is that done in a consensual manner? So very, very important to know that while we have all these arrangements in place, we need to also be very, very sensitive to know that interests do differ, and need to also be respected, and no one is left to feel being on the losing side.
Thank you. And if you would just, we have another question from Mr. Donglona. Although there are several actors in the Sahel, but France has been the one dominating the region. What do you think about its engagement? Does it really contribute to solving the security problem in the Sahel? Dr. Ukiwo.
Well, it does, and I'll just speak to a few ways. You know, number one, France has a convening agency. You know, so France is able to rally around Francophone countries to this table. So, and that is very, very important. And so getting to build confidence with France in this is very, very important. But like I said, the key point is to understand what other interests and what other existing rivalries exist in the region, and how that can be managed. Historically, yeah, you know, there's been some sensitivity around Nigeria's relations with France, and vis-a-vis Nigeria's interests as the sub-regional power, and also France's continued interest in having Francophone countries remain under its own sphere of influence. But again, I think we need to understand those differences and manage it well. It is the case that oftentimes those opportunities have been enhanced. So for instance, when there was a challenge in getting Niger, Chad, and Cameroon to really come under the multinational task force initiative, the agency of France was very, very critical in terms of convening those actors also. So it has a convening agency and it has the role to play. But again, the key issue is to identify what the strategic goal should be, and what other interests in terms of investments and sphere of influence, how that can be addressed.
Thank you. Agachi asks, how can elites be co-opted for reconstruction projects in the Sahel? Dr. Wing mentioned that even as oversight mechanisms are being set up, many times they are not fully developed. That is because elites stand to lose from their development. What can be done in this situation? Dr. Wing?
Thanks. You know, I think Mali is in a very interesting moment right now, as we all know, having just experienced a coup. And I would go back and look at what happened after the coup in 1991 and the national conference that was held, which was frankly quite inclusive, and it didn't go on forever, but it prompted a kind of dialogue in the country that many Malians still point to as a critical moment in their history. And I believe that if we look at what has happened since 1991, there has been obviously an absolute failure to follow through on the promises that were made at that moment. And that has created a good deal of frustration, in part because there was this lack of accountability and transparency. I think if elites can be co-opted, how do we get them to buy into the system? Well, you buy into the system because it doesn't do any good if the system keeps getting overthrown. In other words, the longer term solution is stability, and one would hope that that would lead to buy-in rather than the short-term, you know, I'm in it for my own interest kind of angle, which has not worked out successfully in Mali. And so it's a very good question, but I also think from talking to Malians who do go back to pointing to the kind of transition they had in the early 90s as and basically saying things all went awry since then. And I think that there's you know, hindsight's 2020. We can go back and see where the paths, where things went astray. And I do think it's possible. I think it's actually quite a remarkable moment right now that Malians could hold on to.
Thank you. And so we have a question from
could I say a few words about this still? You have the time?
A few words, yes.
Okay, only to add, from my point of view here, what is not lacking in Mali is dialogue. That's happening all over the place and for years. What's missing here is transforming all this into current practice and then into action. We have, for example, if you talk to Malian constitutionalist lawyers or whatever, they will explain to you that all the discussions about the constitution reform, for example, linked to the Algiers Accords or whatever, this has been there since the 90s. 99% of the reforms are agreed upon and for a long time, but nothing is taken into practice, into action. And that's why, from my point of view, also we are in this very messy situation still here in Mali.
Thank you.
And Professor Chiedo, would you indulge me for 1 minute?
Maybe less than 1 minute, yes.
30 seconds in just one sentence. Maybe also to think about the question, there's another school of thought that maybe says the mobilization that we have been seeing in Mali in the past couple of weeks is also an indication that maybe the elites, it's felt that there's a dominance of the elites. So I think I would agree with Dr. Wing that the conversation has to be both ways. There's a school of thought that sees it in another way, I think. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, to follow up on that, we have a question here about the youth, right? This is from Mr. Gombe. What is the role of youth in Sahel conflict in terms of reconciliation, reintegration, and stability? And if I may just follow that up, we know that in countries where DRL, that's a demobilization, de-radicalization, and reintegration programs, that in some countries they run alongside active violent conflicts. How can we strengthen these programs, right? How can we ensure community buy-in, especially into reintegration programs? As we know, this has been particularly difficult in Nigeria with Operation Safe Corridor. How do we ensure that DRAD programs, especially incorporating psychosocial and economic support work and prevent recidivism? Dr. Ukoha, do you want to briefly tackle this?
Thank you. Yes. So it's very, very critical that DRAD, to be able to be most effective, is not state-centric. There's a key challenge with current approaches in the sense that it is dominated and managed by state institutions, particularly the military itself. And there is little civil society and community participation in it. And the question people ask, for instance, the insurgents, yes, they mobilize against the state, but most of the victims are the people. So engagement of the people is very, very critical here. So one of the key things to do is to ensure that in paneling and designing these programs, that representatives of people, mention has been made of youth groups, should also be included. Representatives of traditional and religious leaderships and women groups should also be represented. There is need to test the mood of the public. One of the key challenges, you mentioned the Nigerian context, has been how community members received people that have so-called been de-radicalized. And it's posed a very major problem because the sensitization has not taken place. People don't know what the curriculum of the DRAD program has been, how they've been engaged, and people don't therefore trust that some of these persons have actually decided to leave the ideologies that they have done. The second point also is really that the derived programs need to be more granular in its approach. We need to ensure that the ideological leaders pass through a different approach. The people that were conscripted pass through a different approach. And this is clearly communicated to the people, and people know how this is being done. That, in a way, in my view, would help to address and ensure that the focus is not just to pass through a state control system and put people back, but is seen in a holistic form. And I think we have examples from, some of the transitional justice systems that we had in Rwanda as a comparative experience, where you had some level of community involvement, and how that created a more lasting reintegration in affected communities.
Thank you. We had a question from Diallo, I think it was, and she wanted to know what is next from here, the product of this conference, if there's going to be a product, byproduct, and what the purpose is to serve. And so, Ms. Diallo, yes, the partners, SAIS and next year SPD, have plans to produce a communique from this conference, which next year SPD leads. And so once we have this, we will be sure to disseminate those, and then we'll communicate this back to you. Nada Afa also asks, would you say that Mali has a strong infrastructure for peace? How can civil society play a more active role when it comes to establishing stability in the country, and why? And are they the key to creating and implementing change, especially during this political transition? Mrs. Daramola and Dr. Wing, if you would please take each less than a minute to respond to this, and then we will get to closing. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chiedo. I think that's a very good and interesting question. And we can't overemphasize, I think, the importance of including and utilizing to the maximum civil society organizations, community institutions, and mechanisms who are well placed and have comparative advantage of in-depth knowledge of the social, economic, religious factors that are often at the root of the issues in the Sahel. So I completely I agree with that question, and I think it's imperative. I would say that the existing peace infrastructure in Mali, characterized by very dynamic civil society organization, is one of the resilience factors in Mali and in some other countries of the Sahel. And I think it's something that really should be utilized when we're thinking about preferring solutions in the Sahel. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Wing?
Sure, I would just underscore what Ms. Daramola has just said. And I would like to add that to this point of, there's been a lot of dialogue and conversation in Mali and a lack of implementation. And I think that in terms of thinking about peace infrastructure, if we need to improve governance, we need to address poverty. These go to the very local level. And I believe that there are local actors, regional actors. There are people who are absolutely committed to doing this and have ideas about how to do this on the ground effectively. And finally, that goes to the point that has come up about mapping of efforts, mapping of efforts from all levels of what people are attempting to do. And in the case of Mali, it really is implementing what people have already suggested should be done, rather than just talking about it. And that's where I'll leave it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And so just a very brief summary. Today, our panelists summarize solutions addressing problems of multiplicity of actors in the region, the complexities of climate change and combined effects on democracy and economic activities, and regional efforts to prevent and to tackle allied military actions. Unfortunately, we cannot get to all the questions, but we at the African Studies and next year SPD, we want to thank you so very much for joining us again today, and for those of you that also joined us yesterday in this very important conference. Thank you especially to our panelists today and yesterday. And so as you can see, we have our last poll up on the screen. If you can just take a second to respond to that. Again, we're very thankful that you stayed with us, and as we all work together towards finding lasting solutions to the Sahelian conflict, we hope you join us again very soon, and please stay in touch. Thank you.